Hey guys, welcome back to another video in the r/EntitledPeople subreddit. I have 3 stories for you today, and they all involve entitled people in cars. You know, the Karen in the Merc SUV that thinks she owns the parking space, or the Kevin in the BMW weaving through traffic and speeding through a construction zone. We've all seen one, we've all rolled our eyes at one, and we all wish the cops showed up to see these idiots at the perfect moment, but of course, they never do. However, the entitled drivers in these stories do finally get their karma, and boy is it sweet. So without further ado, let's jump into the stories. Had a bogey on my tail in the parking lot. Deploy flares. So this happened about a day ago. Honestly, still getting a few random giggles thinking about it. Anyways, I have a local grocery store near me with a decent sized lot. It doesn't usually end up full, but I guess yesterday was crazy for reasons I've yet to care finding out. There was no space, and drivers looking for spots that had even less patience. I got in well enough to the store to do my minor amount of shopping, exiting with barely 2 bags full of snacks and sandwich makings. As I exited, a few of the hovering parking spot snipers were following people from the doors to cars. A guy in a large hatchback tagged me and slowly followed me. Usually, I would dip between cars to the next aisle over, and they don't bother to follow because it gets a little creepy then. I don't like people willfully hovering behind me like that, even less so when in vehicles. Nope! Not this guy. Guns it around the aisle and back to me to follow my path. I jump across again, pretending I was an idiot who forgot where I parked. Guess what? He follows me again. This next time, I'm far more blatant about shaking him off and double back. He promptly lowers his window and shouts at me, "Just find your effing vehicle so we can both be happy." Doesn't even give me a chance to reply before rolling his window up again. I figure my bags aren't that heavy, and the cold was enough so that my sandwich meat was fine if I took a bit. So I began wandering aimlessly, letting the guy think I'm finding my vehicle when I knew exactly where it was. He cursed at me a couple more times and seemed to think he was my designated replacement to his spot. I didn't time it, but I believe he hung on for 10 grueling minutes of my wandering before gunning it hard out of the lot, going straight through a 4-way stop, and garnering the ire of several drivers. No cops, unfortunately. The funny part, as I left, I could clearly see a few scattered spots he could have taken if he weren't so obstinate or driven by pure spite. The best part though, I walked to the store. This is my favorite type of pettiness, and OP delivered it perfectly. The pettiness where you just pretend like you have absolutely no idea what's going on, like you have exactly 1 brain cell left, because we all know something entitled people don't have, and that is patience. Well played, OP. These next 2 stories I'm about to read for you are both posted by the same user, who is an electromechanical engineer that has to deal with parkade gates quite often, and of course, where there are parkades, there are entitled people. So let's see what he's had to deal with, shall we? The Karen with the white Audi. I'm an electromechanical engineer and had been called out to deal with a set of faulty automatic gates. They had stuck in the open position and it was compromising the security of the building. My job was to find out what had caused them to stick open, fix it, and get them working again. This particular manufacturer of the gates used an encoder to tell the control panel where the gates are in their swing, and it turned out kids had been riding them and had caused this to go out of calibration. Recalibration was a simple 2-minute job. I put a couple of traffic cones on each side of the gates and set the calibration going. During this process, the gates open fully and then close fully twice at about half the usual speed. Like I say, about 120 seconds. Enter entitled Karen. She had parked her white Audi in the secure compound while the gates were open, and even though she was only allowed in there to load and unload into her shop, she regularly parked all day in the visitor space, totally against the terms of her lease. So I set the calibration going, and the gates did their first swing totally open, at which point Karen came out to her car and started her engine. The gates started to close again, and Karen pulled out of her space like a nut job and accelerated towards the gates, stopping just before the cones, but revving her engine like she wasn't pleased. Seeing them closing, she pressed her fob button to get them to open, but of course they were calibrating, so they were totally ignoring all instructions from the fobs. The gates closed fully, the lock mechanism engaged, and they started to do their second swing, at which point she started to roll forwards, revving the entire time. Just as she touched the cone with her car, she pushed it back and broke the infrared safety beam, thus aborting the entire procedure and making the gates lock in a slightly open state. She sounded her horn and shouted at me, demanding to be let out. I told her she had caused the processor to fault, and those gates weren't opening anytime soon. It would be at least 5 minutes before I could restart the procedure, as I had to power them totally down. I didn't, but she didn't know. She proceeded to start shouting and getting angry, so I just said, "Sod you, I'm parked outside." I locked the control box, walked to my van with my tools in the pocket, and started driving away. About 2 minutes later, I got a call from the landlord of the building pleading with me to go back and saying that Karen was really sorry. I gave in, I went back, and I started the calibration again. But this time, I deliberately turned the speed on both motors to the lowest setting, so it took about 10 minutes in total. Karen never did apologize, and she still speeded out like an idiot as soon as I moved the cones. But it gave me great pleasure knowing that my malice made her almost half an hour late. You aren't going anywhere for a while. This story involves a rather popular bar in a major northern UK city. This involved a male Karen, henceforth known as MK. It was early in the day, and the bar wasn't open until 7 p.m. that evening. I arrived at the bar, my task for the day being to await a scaffold being delivered and erected, and then use the said scaffold to remove some old CCTV cameras and upgrade them to much better ones. I have a full set of keys for the bar, and the bar has its own private car park, which is protected by locking drop-down bollards. They're not automatic or anything fancy like that, so I have to pull up on the street outside, lock my van up, walk over, and drop the bollards. And then finally, I pull my van inside. I usually then raise the bollards to stop others parking in there. The place in question is extremely close to the Social Security Benefits office, and the bollards were indeed installed because their clientele were constantly using it rather than pay to park like the rest of the population. So this morning I pulled in, got out of my van, and dropped the bollards so I could park in the car park. The scaffold truck with the team on was about 20 minutes behind me, so I had time to go in, have a quick walk to the coffee shop just around the corner. Unfortunately, just after I dropped the bollards, MK drove up in his BMW X5, pulled into the car park, and parked. I followed him in and also parked. I tapped on his window and told him it was a private car park and he needed to leave. He was on a hands-free call and he simply gestured me away. So I tapped again and he wound down his window and shouted, "I'm on an effing phone call," wound his window up and began ignoring me. Although I could have been really malicious and locked him in, I didn't. I simply walked around the corner and got my coffee, leaving the bollards down so he could leave if he wanted. About 5 minutes later, I came back, coffee in hand. He was still there, still on the phone, and I could see the scaffold lorry at the bottom of the hill making its way up. Again, I tapped on his window and he mouthed "F off" at me. The lorry arrived. I gestured them to reverse into the small car park, which they did. It blocked up the whole car park. The team of 3 rather big, muscular scaffolders jumped out and started unloading and building the scaffold. MK finished his important call and then got out of his rather fancy X5 and walked across to the social services building. I presume he thought we'd all be done by the time he got out, so he could just jump in his car and drive off. MK came back about an hour later and said to me, "You have to let me out." I said back, "Mate, you aren't going anywhere. I tried to tell you, but you told me to F off." He started to get aggressive and pushed me, at which point the scaffolders came down and started to back me up. They looked scary. He didn't. He jumped in his X5 and sat there on his phone. 10 minutes later, the police rolled up. Apparently he'd phoned them because we were blocking him in and had threatened him. I talked calmly to the police officer and explained what actually happened, explaining that with it being a bar, the whole incident was on CCTV. I gave them my details and the details of my company, and the scaffolders did the same. Then the second officer started checking our vehicles. So the first officer then asked the scaffolders if they could indeed move and let the guy out, and they obliged, although it took them a couple of minutes to throw some ties over their load. We were all very compliant, although the police did tell us off. It is an offense to knowingly obstruct someone or block someone in a car park or parking space, even on private land. MK then got in his BMW and reversed out through the gates, at which point the second officer gestured him to pull the car up on the road and get out of it. So it transpired after a little more questioning that MK had neither road tax, insurance, nor did he even have a driver's license. The reason the police had to let him get out of the car park was because no crime was being committed until he attempted to drive it. Once he attempted that, he was in contravention of the Road Traffic Act, and they could seize his car. Thus, the final piece of this story involves the police sending him walking to the bus stop whilst the second officer drove his 2-year-old BMW X5 to the impound yard, where he would have to pay a lot of money to get it back, and could only get it back if someone with a valid license and insurance went to collect it. I found out later that had he paid for the £2.70 parking ticket, he would have been over £1,100 better off that day after the cost of getting the car back, plus the hefty fine he was given for driving without the correct documentation or qualification. When will Karens and Kevins learn that they in fact don't know everything and have absolutely zero right to tell people how to do their jobs? Sadly, probably never. But we can dream, right? He's driving without proper licenses, and yet he called the cops. Some people never learned if you're already doing something against the law, you don't go around being obnoxious. Don't call the police if you are also doing something illegal. It's like the idiot calling the cops because his drug dealer cut his cocaine. In this case, it's don't do something obnoxious if you've already done something obnoxious. So true. What a silly, silly man. I can't believe he didn't think that the police wouldn't run his plates. They do this randomly on the highway for frick's sakes. Regardless though, I'm glad they did, and I'm glad Kevin was caught. Karma is a bitch, and justice was finally served on some road raging jerks. Truly satisfying. But anyways, that is all from me today. I hope you enjoyed those 3 Entitled People stories. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. I truly appreciate when you do, and I will see you in the next Reddit story. Bye!